Imagine spending your whole life struggling to survive, only to be dragged into a fight for something you never asked for. Abandoned streets, a place of solitude and struggle. Meet Elijah Carter, a 10-year-old boy whose life has been marked by hardship and neglect. From the moment he was born, he never knew the comfort of a home, the warmth of a parent's embrace, or the security of a stable meal. Raised in a series of foster homes, Elijah learned early on that love was a rare commodity, and food even rarer. "You'll never be anything," they told him. Those words stung deeper than the cold nights he spent huddled in an alley, or the empty feeling in his stomach when hunger gnawed at him. Despite the words that weighed heavy on his shoulders, Elijah never lost hope. Hope was all he had left. Every day was a battle for survival. He would wake up in places that no child should have to call home. Under bridges, in abandoned cars, sometimes just on a bench in a park where people ignored him, or worse, crossed the street to avoid making eye contact. To the world, he didn't exist. He was invisible. Yet despite the world's refusal to see him, Elijah still fought for something better. When the hunger became too much to bear, he scavenged for scraps, sometimes skipping meals altogether just to stretch the little bit of food he could find. But it was never enough. He would ask for help when he could, but the doors were always slammed in his face, leaving him with nothing but the cold night to accompany him. It was a familiar pattern. Elijah knew it all too well. Stores were the worst. People looked at him with suspicion. He could feel their eyes following him, watching him, as though he were about to steal something. And when he would try to speak, try to explain, they would look away. He was just a child, but in their eyes, he was already a criminal. The world had already decided who he was. To them, he was just another black boy, another orphan, another statistic. Despite all of this, there were still moments when Elijah's hope refused to die. Those fleeting moments when he saw someone else smile, or when a stray cat would curl up beside him, offering the warmth he couldn't find anywhere else. Those small comforts kept him going. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? Let us know. On a rainy, cold night, Elijah Carter, soaked to the bone, huddled in an alleyway, trying to find shelter from the storm. His shoes were drenched, his clothes clinging to his small frame. The night felt heavier than usual, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders as he tried to stay warm. The city around him was alive, yet it felt empty. The streets were slick with rain, and the lights from passing cars blurred in the downpour. But none of it mattered. Elijah had learned long ago that the world didn't care about kids like him. He was just another orphan, lost in the chaos of the city. That's when he heard it. A weak groan, soft but distinct, coming from the alley just beyond him. Elijah paused, his heart quickening. He turned, straining his eyes to see through the rain and the shadows. There, lying on the wet pavement, was a man. He was well dressed, his expensive suit drenched, his face pale with pain. The man clutched his chest, gasping for breath, his body trembling. Elijah didn't know who this man was, but he knew one thing: this man needed help. The sound of footsteps echoed in the alley as people walked by, their heads down, ignoring the scene before them. No one stopped. No one cared. It was as if the man's suffering didn't matter. Elijah's stomach twisted. He couldn't just stand there and do nothing. He ran toward the man kneeling beside him. "Mister, wake up. Please, stay awake," he pleaded, shaking the man's shoulder. The man's eyes fluttered open for a moment before closing again, his breath shallow and erratic. "Please," Elijah whispered. desperation creeping into his voice. "Don't die, mister. Please." But he knew he couldn't do it alone. He didn't have a phone, no way to call for help. His hands trembled, but he knew what he had to do. Without thinking, Elijah bolted from the alley, running into the street with everything he had. Cars swerved around him, honking their horns, drivers screaming at him. But he didn't care. There was only one thing on his mind. He waved frantically at passing vehicles, his heart racing. "A man! He's dying! Please, help me!" he shouted, hoping someone would stop. Finally, a taxi screeched to a halt. The driver leaned out the window. "What's going on?" he shouted. Elijah gasped for air, his voice shaky. "A man! He's hurt! He's dying! Please help him!" Without hesitation, the driver pulled over, and together they rushed back to the man lying in the alley. Minutes later, the man was in the back of the taxi, speeding toward the nearest hospital. Elijah sat in the front seat, too anxious to breathe. Every second felt like a lifetime. Would they make it in time? The rain hit the windows like bullets, but Elijah couldn't take his eyes off the man. He needed him to live. When they arrived at the hospital, the doctors rushed the man inside. Hours later, the doctors came out, telling Elijah that if he had waited even 5 more minutes, the man would have been gone. He had saved his life. That man, the one Elijah didn't know, was Richard Sterling, a billionaire, a man who had everything. He was known in the city for his wealth, his influence, and his connections. But in that moment, when his life was hanging by a thread, it depended on a boy who had nothing. Richard was grateful. He asked the hospital staff about the boy, but by the time they went looking, Elijah had already vanished. Back to the streets, back to being forgotten. But Richard never forgot. He couldn't. The boy had saved his life, and that was a debt he could never repay. The next day, Richard made a decision. He went to his lawyer and instructed them to make sure that, if anything ever happened to him, his fortune would go to the boy who had saved him. It was a gesture of gratitude, but also one of a deeper understanding. Elijah had done what no one else had done. He had acted when no one else would. And Richard would make sure he never went unnoticed again. Have you ever helped someone when no one else would? Tell us. The courtroom was silent, an air of tension hanging over the room like a thick fog. Every eye was on the widow, Eleanor Sterling, whose perfect makeup didn't hide the fury etched on her face. Her fingers trembled slightly, clutching the edge of the chair as the lawyer beside her whispered something about strategy. She had expected this moment, expected to inherit everything. But the moment the lawyer read Richard's will, the words had shaken her to her core. "I leave my entire estate to Elijah Carter." The gasp that followed was almost deafening. The room buzzed with confusion, disbelief. All eyes turned toward the boy standing quietly near the back of the courtroom. Elijah Carter, the orphaned boy who had saved Richard's life years ago, now stood as the sole heir to a fortune worth billions. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, her chest heaving with anger. She shot to her feet, knocking her chair back as she did. "What?" she shrieked, her voice cracking with fury. "This is a joke? A nobody like him, over me." She stepped forward, pointing a trembling finger at Elijah, her voice now a low growl. How could Richard do this? He didn't know this boy. He was nothing but a child with a story. The room fell into murmurs. The tension between her anger and the sheer shock of the room created a strange, almost electric silence. The judge, an experienced man whose demeanor had always been calm, raised his hand to restore order. "Mrs. Sterling, please, calm yourself," the judge said, his voice clear and commanding. "The will stands unless proven otherwise. We will proceed." Eleanor's face flushed crimson, her lips trembling with rage. She stepped back, a look of disbelief still painted across her face. But she wasn't about to let it go so easily. The billionaire's widow had never been one to lose without a fight. "I'll not stand for this," Eleanor screamed, her voice high with anger, as she slammed a thick stack of documents on the table before the judge. "This will is fake." She turned to her lawyers, her eyes wild. "Prove it. Elijah manipulated Richard. He tricked him into writing this will. He didn't know what he was doing." The room filled with whispers, and the doubts began to spread like wildfire. Was there truth to what Eleanor was claiming? Had Richard been coerced, pressured by the young boy? Could such a wealthy and powerful man, the husband of Eleanor for so many years, really have made such an impulsive decision? Could it be real? Elijah stood there, still and silent, his face pale. He had no fancy lawyers, no powerful connections. His entire life had been spent fighting for scraps, for survival. This was no different. He had saved Richard's life, but now the battle was one of trust. The truth was all he had. Would it be enough? As the murmurs in the room grew louder, the judge took a deep breath, signaling for the room to settle down. He glanced down at the pile of documents on his desk, then back up at the courtroom. "I believe there's one final piece of evidence that will determine the validity of this will," the judge announced. His voice was steady, but there was an air of anticipation as he reached for a sealed envelope. He opened it slowly, taking out a single sheet of paper. The room held its breath as the judge unfolded the letter. He began to read aloud, his voice calm but heavy with the weight of what was coming. "This is Richard Sterling's last letter. It's dated the day before his death. It says, 'To Elijah Carter, I leave my entire estate. He saved my life, and in return, I want to give him the life he deserves. I trust him. Please, make sure my wishes are carried out.'" The words fell like a hammer, striking the room into stunned silence. The judge paused for a moment before he looked up at the crowd. "This," the judge said, looking around at the stunned faces, "cannot be contested. The evidence is clear." Eleanor stood frozen. Her eyes darted between the judge, the letter, and Elijah, who was still standing, unmoving. The fight was over, and she knew it. The truth had been revealed, and no amount of screaming, no amount of documents or lies could change that. Elijah had won. But at what cost? The courtroom erupted into whispers, some sympathetic to the young boy, others still in disbelief. But for Elijah, the battle had just begun. Have you ever been falsely accused of something? Tell us about your experience. The courtroom was silent, the tension hanging thick in the air. All eyes were fixed on the judge as he slowly unfolded the letter, his hands steady, despite the magnitude of the moment. The weight of the situation seemed to press down on everyone in the room. The paper crackled slightly as the judge cleared his throat, preparing to read aloud. "To my wife, Eleanor." The room was still. Everyone waited, breathless, as the judge continued. "I always knew who you were. I knew you loved my wealth more than you ever loved me, and that's why you will not see a penny of it." The room erupted. A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. The noise was deafening. People looked at each other, eyes wide with disbelief. Eleanor's face, once a mask of composure, now contorted with shock and disbelief. She opened her mouth, but no words came out at first. Her lips trembled as she tried to process what she was hearing. The judge's voice, calm but resolute, cut through the chaos. Elijah Carter is the only reason I am alive today. He had nothing, yet he risked his life for me. That is why everything I own belongs to him now." As the judge finished reading the letter, the atmosphere in the courtroom changed. The gasps of surprise were replaced by a stunned silence. Eleanor's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. Her hands clenched into fists, her knuckles white with rage. The truth had been laid bare for all to see, and there was no denying it now. Eleanor stood up abruptly, her chair scraping across the floor as she did. "No!" she screamed, her voice high-pitched and filled with fury. "This isn't fair! That money is mine!" Her voice cracked as she tried to assert control over the situation, but it was clear to everyone present that she had lost. The entire courtroom was watching, some in sympathy for Elijah, others in awe of how the situation had unfolded. The once powerful widow was now nothing more than a woman, exposed for who she truly was. Her lawyers, who had sat in silence throughout the proceedings, now looked at each other uneasily. There was nothing left to argue. The will had been read. The truth was undeniable. Elijah wasn't the one who had schemed for wealth or tried to manipulate a dying man. No, it was Eleanor who had lied, who had pretended to grieve, who had used her position as the wife of a billionaire to take advantage of what was never rightfully hers. The judge's gavel struck with authority, the sound sharp and final. "Mrs. Sterling," the judge said, his voice still steady but carrying a hint of reproach, "your actions have been exposed for what they truly are. You will have no claim to your late husband's fortune. His will is clear, and it will be honored." Eleanor stood there, frozen, her face pale and contorted with rage. She looked around at the courtroom, searching for any shred of support. But there was none. The truth was inescapable, and the crowd was already beginning to form an opinion about her. A woman who had built her life on lies, who had manipulated a vulnerable man into marrying her, who had cared more about wealth than the person who had given her that wealth. Meanwhile, Elijah, still standing at the back of the room, remained calm. His heart was racing, but there was no fear in him. He had faced far worse than this in his life. He had faced poverty, abandonment, and judgment. But now, for the first time, he was being seen for who he truly was, a hero, a boy who had saved a life when no one else would. The courtroom was buzzing with whispers, some sympathetic toward Elijah, others shocked by the revelation about Eleanor. Elijah had no need to say anything. His presence, quiet but strong, was enough. He had proven that people like him, people who had nothing, could still make a difference. And in that moment, he had made a difference to everyone in that room. As the murmurs died down, the judge spoke again, this time with finality. "The decision stands. Elijah Carter will inherit Richard Sterling's estate, and Eleanor, you will receive nothing." Eleanor's shoulders slumped, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. She turned and stormed out of the courtroom, leaving behind the life she had always taken for granted. Elijah stood tall as the room erupted into applause. The crowd, recognizing the injustice that had been righted, was cheering for him, for the boy who had been given a chance to prove that one act of kindness could change everything. Now, with the fortune in his hands, Elijah could build a future he had only dreamed of. But the most important thing wasn't the money. It was the validation, the recognition, the acknowledgement that he was someone who mattered, someone who had the power to shape his own destiny. What would you do if you suddenly inherited a fortune? Let us know in the comments. The judge cleared his throat, his gavel poised for the final moment. The will stands. Richard Sterling's entire estate now belongs to Elijah Carter. The courtroom was rocked by a wave of whispers, the shock of the decision rippling through the room. Eleanor's face went pale as her mouth fell open in disbelief. She looked around frantically, but no one was on her side. She slumped back into her chair, her shoulders drooping in defeat. Her plan, her years of manipulation had come crumbling down. Her greed, her sense of entitlement had destroyed everything. The very wealth she had sought to claim had slipped through her fingers, and now she was nothing but a woman exposed. Her true character laid bare for all to see. Her eyes darted to the lawyers sitting beside her, but they offered her no comfort. They, too, had failed. There was no longer any hope for her. The judge had spoken. The decision was final. Meanwhile, at the back of the room, Elijah stood still, his heart racing in his chest. For the first time in his life, he was struggling to grasp the reality of what had just happened. The courtroom, once filled with tension and judgment, now felt oddly still. The whispers around him grew louder, but he barely heard them. His ears were ringing. His mind was spinning. He had been chosen. He had been seen. Elijah Carter, the boy who had been invisible for so long, the boy who had been written off as just another statistic, had just been given a future. He was no longer just a child from the streets. He wasn't just the kid who had saved a life that rainy night. He was someone who had the power to change his life. His hands shook slightly as he held on to the moment, trying to steady himself in the face of such a monumental shift. The crowd was a blur around him. Some stood in shock, others in awe. There was a quiet reverence in the air, a recognition that something extraordinary had just unfolded in front of them. The system had failed so many like Elijah, but today it had worked in his favor. Today, Elijah had won. Elijah's eyes flicked to the judge, who watched him with a calm but knowing expression. The judge had made the right choice, the just choice. He had chosen to see the truth, to see Elijah as someone deserving of respect, someone worthy of a future beyond the hardships he had faced. And in that moment, Elijah knew that his life had been irrevocably changed. Eleanor, still sitting in the courtroom, was a shadow of the person she had once been. Her body slumped with the weight of her failure, the realization that her world, built on lies and deception, had just crumbled. She had once believed she could control everything, that her wealth and status would keep her untouchable. But now, as the gavel struck again, marking the official end of her claim, she was nothing more than a woman who had lost it all. But Elijah was different. He was no longer the forgotten boy. He was no longer invisible. He was now the owner of an empire, the recipient of an inheritance that would change his life forever. And yet, in that moment, Elijah didn't feel any of the pride or satisfaction that many might expect. What he felt was something deeper, something that had been missing for as long as he could remember, a sense of worth. The world had finally seen him. They had finally acknowledged him for who he truly was, and that, he realized, was worth more than any fortune could offer. The judge's voice broke through the silence, signaling the end of the proceedings. "This court is adjourned." Elijah stood there, still processing the magnitude of the situation. He hadn't been prepared for this. He hadn't been prepared for the realization that his life, his future, had just changed in ways he could hardly comprehend. The applause from the crowd around him was faint, but to him it sounded like a distant echo. He wasn't ready to celebrate. Not yet. As he walked toward the exit, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders, Elijah glanced back once more at Eleanor. Her eyes met his, filled with something between rage and disbelief. But he wasn't afraid of her anymore. He wasn't afraid of anyone anymore. Because for the first time, Elijah knew who he was, and he wasn't about to let anyone take that away from him. Elijah walked out of the courtroom, his head held high, ready to face the future on his own terms.